Again, my name is Sarah Snabel, and I'm one of the co-owners of PROergonomics. I'm a registered kinesiologist and a certified professional ergonomist. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about PROergonomics, just for, I know we have a wide variety of attendees, so some of you have worked with us in the past, or maybe you haven't at all. And so just to kind of get you up to speed on kind of what PROergonomics does. So we are a consulting company, and we offer a wide variety of ergonomic services, which could include various types of training, like awareness training, or very specific, for example, manual material handling training. We do risk assessments. We do office or computer workstation assessments. We do design reviews. So kind of, before you install something, looking at the ergonomics of it all before it even gets built or installed. And also job demands assessment, or physical demands, where we're documenting or describing the physical and cognitive demands of a position or a task, which is going to be kind of the focus of today's webinar. But just to name a few kind of different services, the team is all registered kinesiologists, and as well, our team is also certified ergonomists and or working towards that designation, which means that we do have a background in kinesiology, kind of with a specific focus on human factors, or that ergonomics piece, as well as a diverse background of work experience in all elements of ergonomics that allows us to be eligible for that professional ergonomist designation. So providing a professional service, a high quality deliverable, those are things that we really strive and pride ourselves on as the team at PROergonomics. And we really try to work as a team kind of behind the scenes. So, you often will work with a consultant who does have that expertise in your industry, and all of us seem to have some different niches or background experiences, or maybe areas that we have a little extra passion for, just kind of in our interest. And then we often kind of collaborate behind the scenes to make sure that our clients really are getting an innovative or a comprehensive solution, right? We're really trying to work behind the scenes and ensure that our deliverables really are the best quality that they can be. So that's just a little bit of background information on PROergonomics. And for today's webinar, we are going to talk specifically about job demands assessments and some of the key features or important aspects that you should be considering. So this would be, right up your alley if you are, you already have some physical demands assessments or job demands assessments in place, and maybe you're looking to evaluate them, see, kind of benchmark or compare yourself to, what's kind of the gold standard out there, and maybe looking to make some improvements. Or if you are kind of new to all of this and thinking that maybe you need to have these at your place of work and your organization and aren't really sure where to start, or looking for some guidelines on what really makes a good job demands assessment, this is going to be, essentially a checklist or an overview of what you want to look for. So my agenda today is short and sweet. Basically, I will spend a little bit of time talking about what is a job demands assessment. So kind of in the sense of how PROergonomics uses that term, because it may not necessarily be the exact same term that you've heard, but make sure that we're talking about the same document. And then talk specifically about their relevance to the return to work process, because that really is where they fit the best. I mean, they can be used in other elements, but specifically talking about how they fit there. And then kind of going through the 5 key features. So, I mean, I've picked 5 that I think are, the kind of the difference makers, or what sets apart a good JDA to a great or fabulous JDA. So these are the key features that we tend to notice, if I'm looking at a JDA that is maybe, I'm comparing to, these features would be the ones that really set them apart. So in terms of a job demands assessment, or JDA, because I'm going to keep calling it a JDA, really what it is an objective documentation or a description of the physical and cognitive demands of a job. So most often, or you may have heard the term PDA, or physical demands assessment, and that is documenting the physical demands of a job. So things like it's probably going to outline the essential duties of the job, so giving an overview of the job. It's going to document the physical, like, strength requirements, so things like lifting, carrying, pushing and pulling. How often does that job have to do lifting of A, B, C items? What are the weights of them? So again, it's kind of describing, you know, what you need to lift and how often you need to lift it. A PDA will describe your mobility required in that job. So sitting, standing, walking, kind of what postures you would be in, like how you move around. It would also include postures, more specifically a breakdown of the different body parts. So usually you're going to see shoulder postures, neck postures, wrist, back, lower leg, just to kind of see where, you know, what kind of postures that position might require. So, you know, you're going to see reaching in your shoulder flexion. You're going to see the different wrist movements come out in, you know, flexion or extension and deviation. So the bending up and down and side to side. Your PDA will also capture, or should also capture, dexterity demands. So gripping demands, gripping and handling, whether it's a full-handed grip, a two-handed grip, a one-handed grip, a pinch grip, just kind of helping to describe, again, what it is that they're handling, what type of grip is required, and often then the weights or forces associated with that. I mean, that would be the general physical demands. And then the cognitive demands are something that we find that we're doing more and more now, just with different legislation that's coming out around mental health. The cognitive demands, again, is an objective documentation of what is cognitively required to do the job. So looking at things like deadline pressures. So what deadline pressures is that position exposed to, and who sets those deadline pressures, and what happens if they don't meet those deadline pressures? So to kind of, or those timelines, right? If it's a deadline, what happens if they don't meet it? So, you know, that's where it becomes that objective, what's required of the job. So when you put those two together, it makes a really comprehensive description of the job. And so us at PROergonomics, we've been terming that the job demands assessment, or JDA. So answering the question, what is a JDA? It's describing all your physical demands. It's describing all your cognitive demands, all in one document. In terms of how or where you might use JDAs, they're most often used in the disability management side of things. So in that return to work or the work accommodation, work modification, that side of things. So, you know, most often you might find it that you've got your, I mean, it could be your health and safety manager, your occupational health nurse, maybe you have a claims manager. I know different places of work will have different titles who are responsible for handling this aspect. But you would often use them to, you know, you might have them, I mean, if you've got them all, you might have a database of them really that are just kind of ready to send whenever you need them. If there was a claim, you would send it along with your Form 7 to the WSIB when there was a claim, or maybe you're completing them on an as-needed basis. So, you know, when an issue happens, then you're completing the job demands assessment and sending it off. But they can be a really valuable resource, again, remembering that they are that objective documentation of the demands of the job, right, the physical and cognitive demands. So they can be really helpful when you are dealing with those WSIB claims, especially if, you know, getting challenged, because in this case, you've kind of got it written out that you've got it written out in more detail than what a job description would provide, for example. It can help you when you're trying to, like if there's any questions about whether or not an injury is work-related. So again, let's say somebody is claiming a wrist injury or a shoulder injury, and you know, you look at the job demands, your job demands assessment, you know, are you sending it off to the WSIB, for example? They can kind of look through to see what level of frequency or what level of demand is actually associated with the wrist or the shoulder to kind of help them determine if it really is work related or not. It can help you in the LTD process, in terms of whether or not a job might be suited to somebody, if it's a position that you might consider them for. It can also be used if we're thinking more from that accommodation side, of bringing somebody back to work. So you might have some documentation like the employee's functional abilities form or functional abilities evaluation. So that's supposed to be like a measurement of what they're able to do. And then you could do a direct comparison if you have this documentation of the demands of the job. So what is the employee able to do versus what does the job require? And it's kind of a comparison, a direct comparison, and objective too, because your FAF might say the employee can lift up to 20 pounds, up to waist height, and no lifting more than 10 pounds above shoulder height. So you could then look at your job demands assessment and see if there is lifting at those height ranges within those weight limits, right? So that can be kind of a nice match or no match, or give you some areas that you know that you might need to focus on. Okay, so they do have to do some lifting over 10 pounds above shoulder height. Can we look at ways that we can modify that? Does that have to be done? Is there another tool, or is there something that we can do? I mean, sometimes that depends on whether it's a short-term or a long-term accommodation, but it definitely helps to give more description or identify some opportunities for those accommodations or modifications, especially when, if you're the one looking at this, you may not be super familiar with the job, and you're just going on the word of the employee, or you think about who might be using these too. Like it could be that you're sending this document, the FAF, and the job demands assessment could be going even to a physiotherapist, for example, as part of like a work hardening or a return to work conditioning program. And so having that information, that description of what the job demands are, can really help them to kind of customize or tailor that work hardening program. There is a section, I say at the top here that it's to be Aoda compliant, but so there's the Aoda, and then within that there's the integrated accessibility standards regulations, and then within that you've got the employment standard, the customer service standard, the built environment. But there is a section in the employment standard that talks about having a return to work program and making sure that you've got a written return to work program, and that you have it formalized, right? So a job demands assessment can kind of help to make sure that you do have that robust program, right? Because you would have opportunities, or you'd have options of how you're going to return somebody to work. So these documents can help, again, with that kind of a more efficient or a quicker matching process. And again, kind of depending on your industry, you might have, if we're talking more, I see this more often in more of an industrial or a manufacturing environment, where they'll have a whole bulk of these kind of done. So, I mean, maybe you're going to maybe you're going to do them for every job in your facility, and maybe you're just going to do them on a bulk, but often we find that they get done if there's a claim. So if somebody has maybe a job that is quote unquote more physically demanding, that might be where you see a job demands assessment being completed. And maybe you have a higher frequency of claims for that particular job because it's associated with higher physical demands. And then it would also be potentially wise to have some job demands assessments created for the positions that you have as potential accommodation jobs, right? So I hesitate to use the term light duty, but I mean, that is kind of, I know that does exist in some places where you have jobs that are already kind of predetermined as light duty for those modified workers. But then you would have, the physical demands outlined there to be able to then show to the WSIB or whoever it is that, well, this is their current job, right? That higher physically demanding job. And this is the modified work that we're offering, right? So you'd have physical demands or job demands assessments that you could show for their current job, and then the temporary accommodation. It just, this is a discussion that I often have when people are thinking, well, where do I start when I'm even doing a job demands assessment? Should I be doing them for the jobs that are more physically demanding? Should I be doing them for the jobs, for all jobs, and if you're working on a budget or a time frame and you're not really sure where to start, usually what I suggest is starting with some of your higher physically demanding jobs, or jobs where you've had previous injuries or previous claims on, but also not forgetting about those jobs that you are maybe considering for the modification or that accommodation, the accommodation job. something that I did want to touch on, just again, because it's been a conversation piece or a topic that has come up several times just, over the last couple of months. And I mean, that is part of what we do, is kind of educating on ergonomics and our ergonomic services. But really, what's the difference between a job demands assessment and a risk assessment? And maybe the question isn't even coming in, what's the difference? But often we might get asked, like, can you do a PDA for me? Or can you do a JDA for me? And then when you get talking to them, it looks like they're actually, maybe what they're actually needing or asking for is a risk assessment, or vice versa. They're asking for a risk assessment, but actually talking about a JDA. So again, just wanted to clarify the difference there, because I know that, again, this question has come up a couple of times, but a JDA, again, it's used more often in that disability management or return to work process. And it describes the job, but it describes the job as is. So it's gonna talk about the essential demands of the job in terms of, lifting frequencies, the weights associated, the different postures that are required, the mobility, like I said, the sitting, standing, and the walking. But that's kind of where it ends. It is a description of what is. It doesn't tell you anything about the level of risk or whether or not, like, it'll tell you that, yes, the person has to lift, or this position has to lift 25 pounds up to 75 inches. But it doesn't give you any indication on whether or not that's considered a hazard, how likely that is to develop a musculoskeletal disorder, right, which is the type of injuries we're trying to prevent with ergonomics. It literally just describes the job and what the demands are. On the flip side, a risk assessment, it's going to use similar information. It's going to take that job demands information, but it's going to then identify hazards and compare them to standardized tools and guidelines. So things like the Liberty Mutual tables, or ANSI, or REBA, RULA, like those are some of the standardized tools and guidelines. Maybe it's comparing to anthropometric tables to determine reach distances or ideal working heights. But the ultimate goal is that we're trying to determine the likelihood of developing an MSD, that musculoskeletal disorder, in that job or task. So it's taking the information from the JDA that, we have to lift something, we have to lift that box of products, the box of parts, 25 pounds up to 74 inches. And yes, I have to lift it 10 times in an hour for 8 hours of my shift. And then the risk assessment is taking it to the next level and letting you know whether or not that's a hazard. I mean, generally it's categorized kind of as a green, yellow, red. So within guidelines, at guidelines, or exceeding guidelines. And then accordingly would give you recommendations for those control opportunities. So whether or not it's engineering, where you would need to change the equipment, change the tools, make workstation layout changes, versus administrative, like some training or policies or job rotation, or things that aren't actually changing the actual physical equipment or tools that you're using, or even some work method, different methods that you might be doing it. So those are the main differences. JDA is describing what is. So it is great and very useful in the disability management and return to work process. And a risk assessment is something that is going to really tell you kind of that level of risk in a lot more detail and give you some opportunities for changes, right? Whereas the JDA doesn't go into that kind of detail. So wanted to talk about some of the key features. So these are, we've kind of got that, what is a JDA? And we've talked about, how are they most often used? And then now let's spend some time talking about those key features or those important aspects that really make a great JDA, or a useful or effective JDA, whatever term that you want to use. But if you're going to use it in the disability management and return to work process, what do you need to have in your document that's really going to make it useful for you? So the first thing that I would suggest is just to start with considering the template that you're using. So if you are, if you're thinking about more of like a manufacturing, like that industrial environment where a lot of your jobs have cycle times, your template may look slightly different, still containing the same information, but the template itself may look a little bit different versus I'm talking about a job in a long-term care or a hospital environment, because the jobs there are not cyclical, and it's possible that I need a little bit more room I mean, it could be something as simple that I need a little bit more room for writing. So in a manufacturing environment, if I'm working on a cycle time and I'm talking about, shoulder postures, I'm saying that they're in shoulder flexion for 5 seconds of every 30 seconds because they're on a 30-second cycle time. Whereas in, a healthcare environment, if I'm talking about that, I might need to, and again, for that manufacturer one, it's 5 seconds out of every 30 seconds. And my description would literally be to retrieve parts from shelf and use nut runner to secure bolt. Nice, short and sweet little description. If I'm now talking about how I might do shoulder flexion in a healthcare environment, I might have to give a little bit more description because I could say something really short and sweet like to provide patient care, but I think that a good job demands assessment would allow a little bit more room for description there. So I could say to provide patient care, but then I might need some room to, in brackets, give some examples, right? So to perform lateral transfers, to reach to supplies on shelves. So I could be talking about the vertical height as well as the horizontal. So in terms of that template, I'm just thinking that if you have a job that is jobs that are more cyclical versus jobs that are non-cyclical, your template may want to look just slightly different to make sure that you've got the right amount of space to capture that amount of detail. On that note, maybe you're a facility that has a mixture. So maybe you have some jobs that are a little bit more complex, like your maintenance workers, and you also have jobs that are cyclical. So ideally, you're having one form or one template that's used for all jobs so that you have that internal consistency, right? I mean, you don't necessarily want to have this checklist or checkbox style of PDA for some jobs and then have this more written or just this detailed more verbal, I guess, kind of template for some of your other jobs. It would just really make sense to have one template. And the reason I mention this, honestly, the reason why we've come up with all of these key features is because we see these kinds of differences out there. So I do think that it's important that you kind of have one template that is kind of standardized for your facility that you can use for all jobs that will really work for your industry. In some cases, you might even want to customize some different categories. Like in our job demands assessments, we would have an environmental section that kind of talks and describes the work environment. So whether it's indoors or outdoors, maybe some of the PPE that they have to wear. And in some cases, again, like when I'm talking about a healthcare environment, something that I'm going to want to talk about is potentially some of the hazards that they're exposed to, like biological hazards, whereas in the manufacturing or industrial environment, that might not be relevant at all. So sometimes there can be some slight customization in those kind of categories, right? It's pretty minor, but just something, again, to keep in mind when you're creating a template. Another key feature is to check out your summary page. So again, I know this kind of from experience is that they spend a lot of time as an ergonomist writing up a physical demands assessment or this job demands assessment, and you put a ton of detail into quantifying the job in the mobility, in the strengths, in the dexterity sections. But the reality is that the people who are reading and using this document aren't you. Like, they're not an ergonomist, and they're not necessarily reading it from that same level of detail. And so from history, I know that having a cover page that is concise yet detailed, really that's like a quality summary page, can be like a really key difference maker in what is perceived as a good JDA or PDA or a not so great one. It kind of sets off that first impression about whether or not you're about to get into a novel, or can kind of preface what kind of data you're about to read through. And in some cases, it may be the only page that somebody else reads. So much to my dismay, not everybody is reading my charts of data. Now, as an ergonomist and I'm documenting the job, I need to have those charts of data in there kind of because at some point that may be used, but the reality is that not everybody is going to read a 5-page document in its entirety. So I do find that having a quality summary page is going to be important. And the things that you're going to want to have on there are, I mean, obviously your job title, but you'd want to have some just background information. So a quick little summary of the job, right? Maybe describing or defining some of the different parts or commonly used tools that they're going to read about. Maybe it's also talking about your shift information. So whether it's Monday to Friday, whether it's an 8-hour shift or a 12-hour shift, basically it's kind of setting the stage for painting this picture of what the job is. Breaks, job rotation, if there's different tasks, and then most importantly is kind of giving a summary of the job. So those essential duties and how much time they're spending on it. Whether it be the overall like hours per shift is usually how we break it down. If it's a cyclical job, you could put amount of time per cycle, and then you'd want to say how many cycles they're doing per shift. But really, this cover page should be giving you this snapshot of the position. I mean, and then as you need more detail, let's say you're looking specifically at a shoulder injury, then you can kind of flip to the page where we're talking more about the shoulder and read that detail. But keep in mind who is reading the document, who's reading a job demands assessment. They are not necessarily going to know the position, right? So your industry inside and out. The terminology that you use is that's normal. That's your everyday thing. I mean, for me as a consultant, I find that's one of the hardest things is one of my biggest challenges is just getting up to speed on the terminology. Could be in healthcare one day, I could be following around a road screw the next day, and just the tools and the terminology that I use in those different industries changes. So just keep in mind, that this cover page should be a really nice snapshot, a nice kind of easy read. I like the word snapshot though, it's like a snapshot or a quick overview of the position. So tell me what the purpose of the position is, maybe show me a few pictures, tell me what the demands of the job are and the amount of time that they spend doing each of those demands. And then, a nice little piece also was like, don't forget, make sure you've got who completed the job demands assessment and the date, because you do want to make sure that they're current. So a JDA with a date missing just screams not great. It definitely doesn't set the tone for the rest of the read, right? Like you definitely want to have the date on there. So make sure you've got those key features, whether you're looking at your current documents or just if you're in the process of creating a template or looking at going into a standardized template route. In terms of the data that you might find within the PDA or within that job demands assessment, you want to make sure that it's clear, concise, and most importantly, objective. So what do I mean by that, and how can we really make sure that it's objective? Well, I would highly suggest that you have got your strength demands, your mobility demands, your lift, your dexterity demands, postures, that they're all quantified using ideally the NIOSH frequencies. So I mean, these are frequencies that are commonly used in the WSAB, the Ministry of Labor. So it's the 1 to 5%. Sometimes they'll also have wording that goes along with it, but the numbers are kind of that's the objective piece, the calculation. So 1 to 5%, 6 to 33%, etc. A job demands assessment that is using different frequencies, it's sort of a red flag to me. It's kind of like, well, where did they come up with those? Like, these are the industry accepted percentages, these frequencies, the NIOSH ones. And so when percentages are kind of different from that, it does make me kind of question the PDA, who did it, where they came up with these numbers. And it also makes it harder to use in the disability management process, in that return to work process, because you might find that the wording on your FAF, for example, will say occasional lifting. Well, what does occasional mean? Well, occasional is actually synonymous with the 6 to 33%. So if you've got an FAF that's saying occasional and you've got your PDA or your JDA that's saying 6 to 33%, boom, you've got a match. But if you've got your FAF saying occasional and then your PDA or JDA document is using another range like, and I swear I've seen it, like 5 to 30%, then yes, technically that's still sort of within that 6 to 33%, but I find it a weird match. Like, why did they choose those percentages? At some point or another, it doesn't make an easy match between the wording that you're frequently seeing in the FAF forms. Again, to keep it objective, you should be having measurements documented in there. So you'd want to have weights and forces measured, not estimated. Ideally, you want them measured. So if they have to lift boxes of product, you want to put the specific weight in. Are they ranging between 10 and 13.5 pounds? Or are we just saying approximately 10 pounds or approximately 15 pounds or no weight at all? I think it's important that we're putting very specific weights in there to show that you've measured the job. I think those are very important. As well, having heights and reach distances will help to validate and kind of add that objectivity when you're talking about shoulder postures or back postures. Again, because we're thinking that like for me, if I'm shadowing somebody doing a job, I could be watching somebody who's 5'4" doing the job, and I could be watching somebody who's 6'2" doing the job. And so some of the postures that I might observe may be different, right? The 5'4" person maybe is reaching a lot higher, or it looks like they're reaching a lot higher, obviously, because their shoulder is elevated more so than that 6'2" person. So I don't want that to sway my documentation. So I want to make sure that I'm adding in some measurements there. So instead of, necessarily commenting on, like, I can still put in an approximate range of motion, but I want to put that specific number in there as well, so that it is better used in that return to work or job matching process. So instead of saying that they reach to 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, I would also want to add in that they have to reach to 64 inches to the shelf, or they have to reach up to 30 inches in front of them to retrieve parts from the conveyor. Having those measurements in immediately adds an element of objectivity. It is a measured distance. It wasn't skewed by the fact that you watched somebody who was 5'4" or somebody who was 6'2". And again, I would make sure that your PDAs or JDAs, again, whether you have them already or if you're looking at doing some, make sure that they don't use subjective words. And what I mean by that are things like heavy, fast, slow, moderate, those kinds of words that are describing. Like, that's what your numbers are for. That's what the weights, the measurements, that's what they're for, right? So you don't have to put in those words like heavy lifting required, or the job requires working at a fast pace. Like, you put in the line speed, or you put in the height that they have to reach to, and then you use that to kind of define itself, right? We don't have to add in those subjective wordings. When I see the subjective words, I just, again, it kind of raises a red flag to me that it's like, well, we've kind of now tried to evaluate the job. But remember, a PDA or a JDA is not meant to evaluate the job. So we shouldn't be adding in words like heavy, fast, etc. In terms of key features of a JDA, again, wanting to make sure that we're keeping that objectivity, but also applying it to the cognitive demands. And this is something that I do find interesting. It's probably one of the #1 questions that I get about, okay, well, you do cognitive demands assessments, but like, how do you make that objective? Like, how can you evaluate a person? And I'm like, whoa, okay, stop there. A cognitive demands assessment is not documenting an individual or evaluating an individual or evaluating their ability in any way. So it is documenting the demands of the job or the task. It is meant to provide some clarity on the level of frequency that a task is done in terms of the mental demand or the complexity that's required. And so the template that we use is kind of a standardized template where we've got different options that we can pick, right? So you've got the time pressure is low, or time pressure is moderate, time pressure is high. And yes, now I've just said to avoid using subjective wording like low, fast, moderate. But in this case, you're going to also add in some description of tasks, right? So to add in that objective piece, because for sure this is a challenging piece to add in, but you want to describe that. So time pressure is low. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, you know what? They do have some deadlines, but they get to set their own schedule. And if they miss a deadline, well, you know what? They can they can rejig kind of their project list to meet the next timeline, versus maybe somebody has to submit a summary report to the ministry monthly. And if they miss that, there is the potential that they could get flagged for, the company can get flagged for a fine. It would look really poorly. Those would be some examples of things that I would want to describe to really add in that objectivity that makes it objective, that clarifies that. So again, it kind of gives you the level of frequency. The deadlines are monthly, or how complex are they, or what are the repercussions. So that's just an example when it comes to the deadline pressures. But I mean, we would also talk about cooperative work or teamwork, confrontational situations. We would talk about just like level of supervisory responsibilities. So whether you have to supervise people or not. But again, it's describing the job and not describing the person. And I think that's really a key piece to look at. So if you do have some cognitive demands already done, or you're kind of considering that this is something that you may want to undertake and get some of these done, a few key things to just keep in mind is that it is not an evaluation of the person or the individual. Just like a physical demands assessment is a description of the physical demands of the job, this cognitive demands assessment is a description of the mental demands of the position. So something very important to keep in mind. Because we call it a cognitive demands assessment, I think people often get kind of nervous that when I'm going to meet with them and interview them, that they think that I'm evaluating them. But as an ergonomist, my job and my specialty is in assessing the jobs objectively, not people, right? No evaluation of the person. So that's how you add the objectivity there. Those are the key features that you would want to look for in terms of the cognitive demands. And really remember, when we're talking about the key features of a job demands assessment, it's going to need to describe the physical demands and the cognitive demands. I do find that there are some variations out there in terms of, like, it's relatively standardized what you're going to see in a physical demands assessment in terms of mobility, strength, postures, dexterity. Those are usually the four main categories. And then in a cognitive demands assessment, you'd want to make sure that, again, that it's kind of matching with the demands that you're using. So something that I'm seeing, or the demands that are relevant to your jobs. Something that we're seeing more often now, and I think the WSAB even has a template out there, is like, you have the physical FAF form, and now there's one for cognitive demands as well. So just making sure that if you're going to use some sort of a cognitive FAF form, that your job demands assessment actually matches with that, right, in terms of the categories. Helps you again with that comparison. And one of the last features that I think is important is to have some pictures. So pictures can speak 1,000 words. I don't even really have to say much about some of these jobs because you can now see, you can picture the postures that are associated with it. Again, keep in mind who is using these job demands assessments, who's using these reports, and where you may be sending them to. Not everybody is going to speak your language, is what I like to say. And I know that I've talked about that a little bit, but I find it especially, there might be an industry that maybe I am not as well versed in. Or when I go in there, they're talking about some specific parts that they use. And maybe at another place that I've been to, they called it something else. But here they have a different kind of nickname for it. So I'm going to use the term that they use all through the document. But to the outside eye, they may have no idea what that is. So a picture can really help to describe that. So, at the top of your strength page, you're talking about, well, they have to lift and grip the stator shaft. Well, how many of you know exactly what a stator shaft is? Well, look, there's a picture at the top of the page that describes, here they are lifting and hanging the stator shaft on the rack, right? So now you've kind of got that picture that kind of goes along with it. I think that in most JDAs that we do, they have pictures, but I do find it, not everybody does. I know that sometimes they can be worried about maybe some sensitive information or proprietary information. They don't want the pictures to get sent out, but I do find that they really can add a lot of value to the JDA. You know, me reading a job demands assessment and maybe it's using some words or parts, or again, some terminology that I am not super familiar with, I find the picture can really help to kind of solidify what it is, right? I can now picture the person doing the task as I'm kind of reading through. So I do know that there are people that don't use the pictures in there, but I find that it does make for just a much more comprehensive JDA in the long run. So to kind of summarize, what I would suggest, again, not knowing what kind of your intentions for everybody who's listening on the webinar today, some of the questions or some of the things that I would challenge you to do, whether you're looking at your own PDAs or if you're, you know, looking at doing some of these, whether it be in-house or third party, look at what you have and then really figure out if they're working for you. So maybe you have them, but what is it that's really challenging? What is it that's really not working that great? What is it that you would change? You know, do you have that nice, clear summary page, that snapshot page that kind of gives an overview of the job? Are they current? Do your job demands assessments have dates on them? Are they current? There's not really a hard and fast rule in terms of when they become out of date, but a general, like a good guideline to follow is that you should be reviewing your documents, your job demands assessments every 3 years, or as significant changes happen to the job. So, you know, you get new parts in, you modify the workstation, so maybe some reach distances change. So, you know, every 3 years, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're redoing the entire document, but you're going through and just kind of making note that if there are any changes that are worthy of the document being updated. Is it in a format that's working for you? So again, are you able to do an easy comparison? Are you using those NIOSH frequencies or some other kind of made up range? Do you find that your PDAs or your JDAs have that objective documentation in there? Are there measurements? Are there weights? Or are things more of an estimate? Do you maybe need things broken down a little bit more specifically, like lifting below knee height, lifting knee to shoulder height, and then lifting above shoulder height? Sometimes breaking out that strength demands can make it more useful as well. Do you have cognitive demands currently described? Like yes or no could be your first step. And then if it's a no, it's, well, do we need to consider adding them in? And if it's yes, do we have enough detail? Are they objective? And are they covering off all the categories that we need? And then whether or not maybe you want to add pictures or more pictures or bigger pictures, those would all be things that could improve your current PDAs. So for today's session, just kind of to kind of help you in that review process, you know, we sometimes make an offer for kind of a gift, basically, for as a thanks of attending and following our webinars and supporting us. And for September, what our offer is a free CDA, so that cognitive demand section when you complete the physical demands assessment, which basically means a JDA. So maybe you're looking at doing a PDA, you're not really sure about whether or not you want to add the cognitive demands piece in, or you think maybe you need it, and you just, you know, you're kind of curious and want to get started. This kind of helps remove that barrier. So when you do a physical demands assessment, if you take us up on this offer, we will do that cognitive demands section for that same job at no charge. And we will send you a follow-up email from this webinar for everyone that attended. And so if you are wanting to take us up on this offer, you just need to reply to the email to let us know that you're interested. There will be a relatively short expiration date, so it's valid from now until the end of November. So you've got about 2 months to consider using it. So I will open the floor to any questions now. And I'll take this opportunity to read through any questions that maybe have been posed. And while I'm waiting for you guys to type, I will let you know about next month's webinar. So next month's webinar in October, crazy to think that it's already going to be almost Halloween, but next month we're going to kind of switch topics here and talk more about office ergonomics. But for office ergonomics for that worker who's not in the traditional setting. So if you've got workers who are calling their office, their car, their home, a hotel, you know, those kinds of irregular office environments, then this is the webinar that maybe is of interest to you. And we're going to talk about how we might address ergonomics for those style of work environments. So going back to the questions, let me just see what we've got going on here. I see a couple hellos and the sound check questions. Okay, well, at this point, I don't really see any questions coming in. So I will stay on for another couple of minutes, just in case anybody is madly typing a question, and I won't disconnect. But if you have to get going to something else, then by all means, you're also welcome to send me a question directly. So info@proergonomics.ca, or you can give us a call at any point. Check out our website, and I'm happy to answer those questions if maybe you've kind of thought of a question after the fact. But thank you everybody for attending today. Watch for that follow-up email with the offer, and we hope to see you at another webinar and to possibly meet you in person to do some ergonomic services. Thanks very much. Have a great day.